I'm really excited to introduce our guest author tonight. I got the pleasure of seeing him this summer when his book was released. And I just thought, oh my gosh, we have to keep having this conversation. So Jonathan Mingle is joining us from Vermont, an independent journalist. He has written about the science and politics of climate change, energy and resource issues, technology, public health, and other subjects for places like the New York Review of Books, the New York Times, Slate, the Yale Environment 360. Jonathan is a former Middlebury Fellow in Environmental Journalism and a graduate of UC Berkeley's Energy and Resources Group. And his first book, which we do actually have over here, is Fire and Ice, Soot, Solidarity, and Survival on the Roof of the World. As a 2020 Alicia Patterson Foundation Fellow, Mingle reported on the political, legal, and grassroots battles over new methane, aka natural gas, infrastructure, and its implications for the global climate and the clean energy transition. That work led, in a winding fashion, to his conversation here tonight on his latest book, Gaslight, the Atlantic Coast Pipeline and the Fight for America's Energy Future. Let's give him a warm welcome. It's on. It's on. You can put it up there. And
Thank you for that warm welcome.
Yeah. Well, he just got off the airport in Dulles from Vermont, so I really feel like that's something. I'm going to dive right into the topic and I'm going to put this out. What is your reaction to the statement, cheap, abundant, clean natural gas?
Well, I do have 300 pages that could answer that. My reaction is, I think that is a narrative. Those are words that a lot of people are familiar with. If you pay any attention at all to natural gas, which, plenty of people don't, I've discovered, most Americans, surveys show, associate natural gas with the words clean, energy, affordable, reliable, abundant. It's interesting to note, and I still find this remarkable, this was true 10 years ago, I think it's still true now. A majority of Americans do not associate the words natural gas with fossil fuel or with the word methane. If you ask them, what are your associations with methane? A majority of Americans will say words like greenhouse, pollution. They have negative associations. And so somewhere in there lies a story, right? The disconnect there. Because it turns out that natural gas is methane. It is 90% methane, on average. And the reason companies want to pull it out of the ground and pipe it long distances and burn it to make electricity or to fuel industrial uses or put, in our basement furnaces is because of the methane in it, right? So, I was aware of this several years ago as a climate and energy journalist, and I found it really interesting, and I still do. And that set me on this journey, 5-year journey of which this book is the result.
I think that's one of the parts, like most Americans, I don't read, thesis papers on this or anything. And I love that you give a bit of history of natural gas, of how we got here, because so many times how we got here is as important to the story as where we're at. And I guess I want you to say in a very quick kind of thing is, you called it the gold rush of the 21st century. How did natural gas become the gold rush?
Well, in a word, fracking. So the advent of hydraulic fracturing to unlock oil and gas reserves that were previously, you could reach them, but you couldn't reach them in a way where you might make money if you were an oil and gas producer. And there was a gentleman, I think his name is George Mitchell. He was a Texas oil guy, wildcatter, and he labored for years. You know, everyone's told him he was crazy, but he had the last laugh because he kept testing different techniques to, you know, inject sand and lubricants and fluids deep underground to literally fracture sedimentary rock formations. And to liberate, you know, the oil and gas, the hydrocarbons that have been sleeping there for hundreds of millions of years. And that technology really took off in the early 2000s and then really took off after the Great Recession, you know, 2008, 2009. And so you know, that's what created this gold rush that I describe early in the book, where you have all of these companies, big and small, in places like the Marcellus Shale, which stretches from southern New York through Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and beyond. The Permian Basin in Texas. And they were producing so much oil and gas, they needed to find a way to bring it to market. And there were all these companies who said, aha, you know, it's an overused analogy, but it's like during the gold rush, there were the Levi's jeans, right? Like they sold the dungarees and the picks and shovels to the miners. They're the ones who actually made money. And so there were energy companies, even ones who weren't historically involved in building pipelines, like Dominion Energy, said, whoa, this looks like a real opportunity. We should get in on this.
And it was even, not to mention later debates and things, but bipartisan. And Green was endorsing that, Sierra Club. And
yeah. I mean, so, you know, this was the closest thing you could get to near universal bipartisan agreement circa 2009, 2010. President Obama was all in on natural gas, you know, left and right, big green groups, head of the Sierra Club, became buddies with the head of the second largest gas producer, Chesapeake Energy, because everyone thought gas, as the former head of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission told me when I talked to her, we all thought gas was the savior back then. And there were voices saying, wait a second, hold on, it might be more complicated than that at the time, but they were drowned out by this. There was kind of a rah-rah moment where everything lined up, right? Green groups wanted to get coal off the grid because coal is more polluting than natural gas. If you're going to make electricity, it is true that using natural gas produces half the carbon emissions as burning coal. What that doesn't account for is methane. So if any of it leaks in the process from the well through the pipe to the power plant to your furnace, methane is a super powerful greenhouse gas. And so that never really entered the conversation. And the force of this narrative became so strong that, you know, if you were voicing some objection at the time, you really couldn't get a hearing in the halls of Congress or in the halls of your county, you know, Board of Supervisors meeting. And I think that's important backstory because it explains how projects like the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, which is what I write about in the book, how they come to be. How do they land in the laps of people in Augusta County or Nelson County or Buckingham County, Virginia, in the first place?
Which then begs that question of being from Vermont and with all the writing you've done, the first book being based in the Himalayas, on climate, why this pipeline, why this fight? Why did you write this book about the Atlantic Coast Pipeline and specifically the Valley?
It's a great question. There were many times when I asked myself, why am I doing this? But because it took me a while. I'm a slow writer. But to back up, I will answer that by way of referencing my first book, which was about a pollutant And that seems like a hard sell, and it is. I wrote a book about soot and all the ways in which it's bad for you to breathe and bad for people in rural India to breathe because they're burning wood and dung to cook their food. And it's bad for the climate. And, one thing I've learned over the years, it may seem obvious in hindsight, but you kind of have to learn it the hard way sometimes. People want stories about other people they can relate to. And it's hard to relate to a pollutant, right? But again, I'm a climate and energy reporter, and I spent some time reporting on methane. And as I said earlier, I was fascinated by the fact that most people don't know natural gas is methane. Most people don't know that methane is skyrocketing. The levels of methane in the atmosphere are skyrocketing. And I was doing stories about that and why was this happening? And some of it is leaks from oil and gas operations, but some of it's from wetlands. And so I was doing all this science reporting. And I knew I was keeping an eye out for a story about methane that would bring it down to earth, with the human dimension. And on a visit to my family, I grew up in Charlottesville, Virginia. And my parents were living there, and I went to visit, and I was keeping tabs on this pipeline fight. I'd been reading about it. I was emailing people about it. This was 2019, early 2019. And I went to the federal courthouse in Charlottesville because there was a court case which, to any normal person, seemed designed to make your eyes glaze over and fall asleep. But to me, I was like salivating because it was about Dominion Energy was suing Nelson County, Virginia, Board of Supervisors, little old Nelson County, the first community after 5 years. So this pipeline was proposed in 2014. This was early 2019. Nelson County became the first in the crosshairs of Dominion's lawyers. And they sued Nelson County because Nelson County had passed a floodplain ordinance. Again, so boring, floodplain ordinances. I mean, this is the stuff of small d democracy, it turns out. But Dominion wanted exemptions to cross streams and rivers in Nelson County. It would have to do this dozens of times with its 42-inch pipe before it drilled under the James River onto Buckingham County. And Dominion County said, well, we have this floodplain ordinance that we passed a few years ago, and it designates natural gas as a critical hazardous material, and you need special permission to cross each one, and we do not grant that. You have to apply each time you want to cross. And so Dominion said, okay, we'll see you in court. And I went to this court hearing. And I know this is a winding answer to your question, but this is kind of the moment when I was like, aha. I entered the courtroom, and on one side of the courtroom, there are just the lawyers from McGuire Woods, the law firm that was representing Dominion. And on the other side, packed to standing room almost, on the Nelson County side. And I proceeded to listen as the arguments did not go Nelson County's way that day. But it was almost like they were following the very technical arguments over, like, does the Natural Gas Act of 1938 preempt the National Flood Insurance, Act? And it's just like super arcane. But these people were like groaning and gasping and like scribbling furiously. And I was like, there's a story here. What explains this turnout, people of all ages, and what percentage of Nelson County is in this courtroom? And so that was the beginning. I wound up that week I went and climbed mountains with people who would become key characters in the books in Nelson County. They showed me mountaintops that would be flattened for the pipeline route. I went to a workshop rally where a gentleman named Tom Hadwin, who lives in Waynesboro, retired energy utility executive, and he's getting up there in his like cardigan sweater and explaining, to people in their camping chairs why this pipeline was a bad deal for ratepayers in Virginia and just didn't make sense economically. And that caught my attention. And so I kept having these experiences early on that persuaded me. I had no idea I would write a book, but like maybe I'd write a story about this because this deserves a wider hearing. What's going on here in this part of Virginia?
and you mentioned story and these people, and I think that's incredibly important from a reader perspective. It's how, reading it for the second time, I built this empathy that even though I know some of this, I've been participant, I have witnessed neighbors, seen the pain, your writing of these specific people was such a counter effect, and it put us there. So it was so beautifully done. I also think that the question, I love this, that it really lays counter to the claim that Dominion said early, that about their 42-inch diameter, 600-mile pipeline, that once it's laid, yet few people will notice it. So I just picking out some of those people, I was going through the names there's so many: John Ed Purvis, Rick Webb, Nancy Sorrells, Tom Hadwin, Joyce Burton. I just couldn't even list them all. And I just wanted you to kind of talk about, you mentioned Tom Hadwin, but some of those, just one character to kind of exemplifies how difficult was it for you to choose those characters, and why?
So yes, it was difficult in some ways when you sit down with your mountain of notes and transcripts and you have to sift, right? You're just like wheat from the chaff in narrative sense. And that, I interviewed many people who I don't mention in the book, and behind each of those people are hundreds more, right? So each character in the book is kind of a proxy for many, many anonymous people who kind of got up off their sofa and went out and went to meetings, and all because they didn't believe this project was in the public interest, right? I got to know Joyce Burton early on. So Joyce Burton was one of the people I met on my early reporting trips, who connected me to other people, because Joyce she was a physical therapist in Nelson County, in-home physical therapist. So she would drive around and go into your house and help you recover from surgery or whatever you needed. And she essentially gave up her career and began fighting this full time as a volunteer. And then later she kind of got paid, 10, 15 hours a week, but upended her life. And so I chose to focus on Joyce as one of the key people I followed throughout the story, because every conversation I had, certain people would come up again and again. Oh, have you talked to Joyce? And so after a while, you're like, oh, well, she's the connective tissue for a certain number of people. And that was her job. Her job was to go and help landowners on the route of the pipeline figure out what the heck was going on. What were their neighbors doing? Were they negotiating with Dominion for an easement? Because Dominion needed to assemble thousands of parcels, easements, right? So they had to, the sheer ambition of the project, they had to go through 2 national forests. They had to, with, by the way, some of the steepest, most landslide-prone terrain in North America. They had to cross the Shenandoah Valley and its karst terrain with all the risks that poses to water supplies, and do that safely. And then they had to drill a mile-long tunnel, essentially, a 5-foot wide tunnel through the Blue Ridge Mountains, under the Blue Ridge Parkway, the Appalachian Trail, onward under the James River to the sea. And ambitious, right? But not only that, they had to negotiate with each individual landowner along the way. And early on, it became apparent to people that Dominion wasn't exactly interested in having you talk to your neighbor to know, what conversation they were having. So it was hard for people to get information. Joyce became the person who people would call and text, and she would visit them. So that was, in a sense, an easy choice, right? As in terms of a narrative choice, because she really was doing that connecting work, right? But in other respects, it was really hard, because I firmly believe, as a reader of nonfiction, we could do a show of hands, but I think most people find it easier and more enjoyable, actually, whether it's a novel or a piece of nonfiction, to follow one or two or at most maybe three characters that you really get invested in, right? You want to, what happens to them? I want to know. I want to know what happens next. It's a tough sell with 12 or 15 characters. So, you know, in the middle of my reporting, I was starting to anticipate, oh no, like basically what I've signed up for is stitching a group portrait, right? And I think that's a taller ask for a reader. But I had no other choice, because that was the point of the story. It was a story of coalition building, and, you know, spoiler alert, they won. They stopped the pipeline. You know, it's all right. It's on the dust jacket, actually. And you all know anyway, if you live around here. But so, you know, when I decided to write a book about it, I was really interested in tackling this question of how did they pull this off? Early on, the people who really stood up and said, I don't know about this, I'm gonna do something about it, everyone told them this is inevitable. Because you're going up against Dominion Energy, the narrative of natural gas, you know, Dominion is the leading contributor to every politician back then in Virginia. You're wasting your time. So I was really curious, like, A, what explains the fact that people like Joyce, after 5 years, are still fighting harder than ever by the time I show up and start talking to her? And B, how did they do it, right? And we could get into how they did it, but that's the book.
I just taking you back, though, to that. There's a scene in Highland County that I think is worth, where when Dominion first presented their plan to a group of folks in Highland County, why were they insulted by that?
So what I heard from folks who were at this, you know, they called it the dog and pony show. Their words, not mine. But charm offensive that Dominion mounted in the summer fall of 2014. So they come out to Highland County and here in Augusta and Nelson and do a PowerPoint and start to make the case for their pipeline and explain, here's why we think it's going to be good for you. You'll get tax revenue. There will be jobs, temporary jobs, but temporary jobs are better than no jobs in a lot of places. Certainly that message resonated in communities in West Virginia where they were coming through. And when we're gone, you'll barely even notice it. It'll look like a golf fairway. And they were showing slides of like elk grazing atop like a pipeline corridor, neatly mowed, you know. And as Rick Webb, who was there, who's I write about in the book, a key figure, he told me, he's like, there haven't been elk here in a long, long time. You could have done a little research, right?
Get the right picture, right?
And he was insulted by that, but more to the point, he had started researching the risks of building something like this in very steep terrain, where you get these torrential downpours. What happens? How do you keep that pipe on the mountain? And he was starting to get really concerned. He called people who had been on pipeline jobs in other parts of the country, and so at this presentation, he didn't hear much about how are they going to mitigate these risks. It was all about, you're welcome, basically, and trust us. We know what we're doing. And that was a message that really fell flat and alienated a lot of people. And I think it was a tactical error. It alienated the Forest Service. There's a whole chapter in the book about the back and forth Dominion with the U.S. Forest Service, and they are very concerned about running this pipeline through their national forests. And one of them, the supervisor for the Monongahela National Forest, tells his boss, high up at USDA, look, I don't know how they're going to keep the pipe on the mountain or the mountain on the mountain. And we still haven't gotten a good answer from them. And so when you hear that sort of encounter enough, as a reporter, you're like, okay, there's a chapter.
Need some answers here.
Yeah.
You mentioned to just that Goliath of might, and it was the predominant feeling with news articles, that were titled "All Revved Up but Unlikely to Win." What kind of tools. I mean, what? How did we begin? How did that happen? That chipping away, and what was? I keep thinking of David and Goliath, the Davids and Goliath, and I'm like, what was in the slingshot? What did they do?
To go back to that time, as people told me, they felt very in the dark. A lot of people, they were concerned, didn't have a lot of information, and I write about how a few people just started driving down the road, knocking on their neighbor's door if they didn't have their phone number, or they call them, or they go down to the county office and pull the land record to see who owns this parcel, trying to figure out where's it going to go. It turns out that simple act of trying to talk to your neighbor, it kind of, in retrospect, it's like a superpower. This sense of isolation and feeling overwhelmed. A giant energy company wants to build this giant pipe and fill it with flammable gas through my yard, and my property's been in my family for 10 generations, but there's nothing I can do about it. I write about how that's a very isolating moment for a lot of people. But there was another moment in, I think it was June 2014 that I mentioned, in Nelson County. I think it was at the library. And 120 some people turn out, right? So again, that's like, a significant fraction of the population in Nelson County. And I've seen video, I wasn't there, right? Back then, I wasn't reporting on this, but I've seen video of it, and the atmosphere is very charged. There's a lot of anxiety in the room. And this gentleman named Ernie Reed, who's now on the Board of Supervisors in Nelson County, but became a key figure in this whole story. He says something very prescient. Two things, actually, at this very early moment. And it says, the most important thing you can do is go talk to your neighbor, right? Get information. But in the act of doing that, you discover that you're not alone, that other people have concerns like yours. They may not have all the same concerns or fears, property rights, water quality, safety, greenhouse gas emissions, whatever. There's a gamut of fears that people brought to this, despite Dominion's repeated, blandishments, like, you got nothing to worry about, you'll never notice it. He said another prescient thing in that meeting, which was that I anticipate that we're going to be a much bigger obstacle for Dominion Energy than any of the federal agencies. They need to get so many permits to build something like this. And he was right about that. And so, in answer to your question, I've thought about this a lot, and I've spoken to groups of people who are intimately involved in this whole Atlantic Coast Pipeline saga. And I'm always like, what can I tell them that they don't know, right? But I've been encouraged to hear that people who've read the book, even though they lived it, learned some things. And I found that it might be useful for me to distill back to them some of the things I learned from listening to them. And one of them is, and again, it sounds like kind of obvious, but I think it's easy to forget. I live in a rural part of Vermont. It's a lot like this, foot of the Blue Ridge kind of feel. And I can go weeks without seeing my neighbor, right? And local newspapers are dying, and we all follow national politics and cable news, but nobody knows who's running for, my select board is like our Board of Supervisors. And it's easy to feel disconnected in this moment we're in. But when people started, they had this shove. Dominion gave them a shove, like, get out of your house, drive down the road, and go talk to your neighbor. But once that started, it snowballs. And then once that happens, the other superpower kicks in. Again, I'm imposing in retrospect. That's what writers do. We take the chaos of lived events and retrofit our narrative on them. But they discovered another superpower, which is I don't know if it's the ability to imagine this not getting built. Like a future in which Dominion does not build its 600-mile-long methane gas pipeline that could operate for 80 to 100 years. This ability to overcome this sense of inevitability that everyone starts to succumb to, which again, people like Rick Webb heard it from his neighbors, like, I support what you're doing, but you're wasting your time. So once you connect with your neighbors, you encounter people who help you. Maybe you discover maybe if we really don't think this is in the public interest, and if we really don't think that it belongs not only in my community but that neighboring county, or anywhere in Virginia, maybe I should do something about it. Maybe we can pull this off.
I think that's the root of the hopefulness in reading your narrative and the story. Before we go to questions from the audience, I just want to ask one more, and I have many others. I kept writing questions and more. Beyond the question of whether the Atlantic Coast Pipeline was in the public interest and necessity, your book also raises the question of environmental justice. And I wondered if you could just speak a little bit about that and the people who lived in Union Hill, Virginia.
Sure. So Union Hill is an unincorporated community in Buckingham County, and it was founded by emancipated, formerly enslaved Black Virginians right after Civil War. And that was where Dominion chose to build its compressor station. So when you build a pipeline, you need compressor stations. Pressurize the gas, send it through the pipe. As it moves through the pipe, it kind of loses oomph, right? You got to repressurize it. And so you burn the gas itself to run these like jet engines, basically. Very loud, 24/7. And they had to put, I think, 4 of these, and they wanted to put it right in the middle of Union Hill. State of Virginia, Commonwealth, of Virginia said, okay, we're okay with that. We've looked at this area, and we don't think there's a disproportionate burden on anyone who lives here. There are no environmental justice concerns. You're good to go. Gave them a permit, because you need a permit because these things produce air pollution. And so the regulators need to, ascertain, like, this isn't going to threaten anybody's health in a way that's unfair. Well, the people of Union Hill took issue with that. And because in those filings, Dominion and the Virginia regulators, in granting that permit, basically said, this is not a community of color. This is, fewer than 30%, African American, and there's nothing to worry about, basically. And the people of Union Hill said, actually, no, and by the way, they also said nobody really lives here. They're not here during the week, not many people. And people said, actually, we do live here. And they went door to door and organized a survey to prove that they were more than 2/3 African American households in Union Hill, and that they suffered asthma and other ailments, at a higher rate than neighboring communities. And so that began this journey where they took it to federal court and succeeded in having that permit thrown out. And that was a very important decision because it set a precedent that I think will kind of, ramify beyond just this one story. But it was also a key loss for Dominion, and was one of the dominoes that kind of fell before the big one fell when they decided to cancel the pipeline.
Yes, we'd like to get to those key dominoes, but I am going to take it out to you all for questions. Yes. The question being that the Mountain Valley Pipeline, the twin of this pipeline, has had many kinds of protests and environmental problems. Why did that get a green light? Why is that now flowing methane today?
So the Atlantic Coast Pipeline and the Mountain Valley Pipeline were proposed on the same day in 2014. They were approved on the same day by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, which, if you don't know about it, FERC, it's like the most important federal government body that nobody knows about. And they were twins at birth, in a way. Mountain Valley Pipeline, 300 miles long, but through very similar terrain and further south of here. They even originate in the same part of West Virginia. I've had people ask me, why did the folks who fought the Atlantic Coast Pipeline win? Is that playbook they developed even applicable given what's happened with Mountain Valley Pipeline, which earlier this summer got final approval to begin pumping methane through it, despite some pretty serious problems that have emerged, right? Where the pipe ruptured during testing. They had to remove a big section of it and figure out why. There have been hundreds of water quality and erosion violations. You know, I could go on. My answer to that question is Joe Manchin, Senator Joe Manchin. I think the people who fought the Mountain Valley Pipeline for almost a decade had it on the ropes. That company kept begging for extensions, and the Attorney General of Virginia basically sued it for all these violations. It wasn't clear that it was ever going to get finished. And then Joe Manchin insisted in negotiations over an unrelated piece of legislation that was going to raise the debt ceiling. Must pass, right? Or global economic meltdown will ensue. The hardest of deadlines. He was able to insert a provision that kind of forced through all the remaining approvals that pipeline needed and prevented any further judicial review. Courts couldn't weigh in anymore on whether those permits were issued correctly, right? And so Senator Tim Kaine, he didn't support this and spoke on the floor of the Senate because of the precedent it would set, right? Why should they get a get out of jail free card? Is kind of what some people said. But it passed. And then, FERC, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, gave the final go-ahead. And now it's in operation. And so, but for that last-minute maneuver, I don't know if it would have gotten built. I think the playbook was very similar, and there was a lot of solidarity between people who fought the Atlantic Coast Pipeline and the Mountain Valley Pipeline, people going back and forth to support each other. And the Mountain Valley Pipeline, more of it got built sooner. And I think that may be another reason why it was further along. And it became easier for officials and investors and everyone to say, well, look, it's almost done anyway, and they canceled the Atlantic Coast Pipeline. We still need the gas, right? And so it had that narrative push too. So that's my answer to that question, but I think it's an unsatisfying answer in a lot of ways. And I write about, so it was a 2-to-1 vote. There are 5 commissioners on the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. There was a dissent, very unusual. Cheryl LaFleur was the chair of that commission, and she voted against approving the 2 pipelines back in 2017. When I asked her why, she said, I couldn't see that they were both needed, and they were gonna probably cause a lot of damage. And I wasn't persuaded by the case that was made economically to justify them, because no one ever really studied, is there a need for all this gas? When you add up these 2 pipelines in this region, never really got scrutinized.
Oh, did you get leaned on at all by Dominion?
Yet.
And the further question is, has there been a response since you've come out with the book?
No, I haven't heard from them. And they, I talked to one of their folks, public relations folks, early on, and we had conversations. And but after a while, they didn't reply to me and my requests, and which it's fine. But I found plenty of other avenues to try to get a sense of what Dominion leadership might be thinking. How do they make decisions? It would be best to just ask Tom Farrell, the late Tom Farrell, who was the CEO during all this of Dominion, or one of his, fellow executives. That would be best if you could just sit across the table and ask them, why were you so hell-bent on building this? What have you learned from the failure to build it? But that didn't happen. But fortunately, these things are so extensively documented because, again, the alphabet soup of agency permits you need: Fish and Wildlife Service, National Park Service, Forest Service, Army Corps of Engineers, Virginia Department of Environmental Quality. Like, there's so much that you have to put in the public record. And then there are these court filings, voluminous record. And then there are investor calls where leaders of these companies tend to be a little more forthcoming about what they're thinking and how they're planning with investors. And that becomes, for me, that's like a gold mine. And so you can stitch together, I can never say definitively what was going on inside their C-suite, but you can start to get a picture of it from all these other public statements, including statements where Dominion witnesses are under oath. They have to tell the truth to their regulators, state regulators. And there are moments where those witnesses are forced to acknowledge, like, rates will probably go up for our ratepayers after we build this. And we didn't really study whether we needed this pipeline to supply the natural gas power plants we wanted to build. So there are these moments where the truth surfaces regardless. If you're willing to dig through many PDFs late at night on your computer. Yeah.
Or you can just read a pleasurable book.
Or you can just read the book.
Yes. Yeah. How did they settle with properties where they already had the easements, they'd already plowed their land or chopped their trees?
So when all is said and done, so Dominion and Duke Energy, the other company behind the project, when they cancel it in July 2020, that starts a process where they go to FERC, again, the most important federal agency you've never heard of, and say, FERC, here's our plan to restore the corridor. There are different ways we can do this. It's up to that agency to decide whether we're going to make you pull the pipe out of the ground and reseed or just leave it be, or some combination. And so FERC said, just leave it. Leave the pipe where you buried the pipe in West Virginia. But those places where trees were felled in both states, again, after a while, it becomes more disturbance to mess with it rather than just let it grow back. And so that's kind of what happens, right? The other piece of that is there are many people whose easements have not been restored. Dominion still owns them. And some have been released, but not all. And so there are people like Joyce Burton who, 10 years later, she wants to do other things with her life, but she is still, in her own free time, advocating with senators' offices and with, Dominion through various channels to get them to release those easements back to the people who own them originally, who want to do things with that land. They may want to sell that property. They may want to build a barn or a house for their kids or their parents, and they can't do that. And so there's still people waiting to move forward.
At the time when you were writing the book, you said that Dominion and Duke only had about 10% in renewable energy. And I just wondered, with the defeat of that and with the shift, and I think Tom Farrell no longer, what has the turn been since then towards renewables?
So definitely a dramatic turn of events. I don't want to overstate it because in some ways, the utilities of the Southeast are some of the, shall we say, foot draggers in the clean energy transition nationwide. They are still proposing to build a lot of new natural gas power plants when it's unclear that they're all needed. And in a lot of cases, putting these arbitrary caps on like battery storage, rooftop solar, community solar. So I don't want to pretend that, everything is flipped on a dime, but it is noteworthy, I think, that a couple months after this pipeline is canceled, and up until that point, the leadership of the companies kept saying, we need this. Our region needs it for economic prosperity, to attract jobs and industry, to keep the lights on. We can't keep the lights on without it. They cancel it. The lights stayed on. Virginia's economy, by all accounts, seemed to do just fine. But very shortly thereafter, they're taking out full-page ads in the New York Times, the Washington Post, touting the wind farm they want to build. And indeed, Dominion is building the largest offshore wind farm in the U.S., like 26 miles off of the coast of Virginia Beach. And whatever you think of wind, it is not natural gas. It is not a natural gas pipeline. That is a dramatically different investment in a different kind of energy future. And I don't think that happens if the Joyce Burtons and the Rick Webbs and the Nancy Sorrells push relentlessly to force scrutiny upon this pipeline and turn this enormously powerful energy company in a different direction. Dominion sold most of its gas assets, storage, like pipelines, storage facilities, and today I think they're largely divested of most of their natural gas assets. Again, that is a dramatic shift because, one of the things when I decided to write the book, and I wanted to write the story of how did we all come to believe natural gas is like clean energy when it's a fossil fuel. It's better than coal, but hold on, there's more to the story. Dominion was the poster child for this, it's called the dash for gas, right? Like they were all in, and the pipeline was going to be the crown jewel. It was like their most ambitious project yet. And today they're not in that gas business anymore. And their new CEO his strategy is to pivot towards the all electric future, right? They see where the future is going. We're going to electrify everything. But of course, that electric future for Duke, Dominion, Southern Company based in Georgia, could be natural gas fired, right? So that hasn't changed as much. But they're not building pipelines anymore. Got to keep the lights
question
on.
about lights and who's seeing the light and who's keeping them on. How effective was the Virginia Clean Economy Act in changing their minds in Virginia?
I've put that question to several people, and I guess I would say two things about it. One is people who were very involved in the passage of that law acknowledge that did the grassroots energy unleashed by this pipeline fight over 6 years, did the backlash to it, which put Dominion, in a lot more of a spotlight, not in a great way for them, contribute to, more public awareness of what our utilities are doing, our monopoly utilities? And so people said, yeah, it certainly played a role. Did it explain why that law got passed? A law which requires Dominion to go 100%, clean energy by, I think, 2045. No, I'm sure there are many other factors at work, but I do think it's part of the story, right? That, that wind farm and the Clean Economy Act, in an alternate universe where the pipeline gets built and, Joyce and Rick and Nancy decide to, do other things with their time, like beekeeping. I don't know. Does that act get passed when it gets passed? Now, I also asked, folks who were involved in this story, like DJ Gherkin, who's now the head of SELC, Southern Environmental Law Center. What do you think about this? Is this a good deal for Virginia ratepayers if Dominion has a monopoly over offshore wind power now, and there's no competition? And, his analysis, he said something memorable to me, which I think I quote in the book. He's like, look, these utilities, I don't think they're good or bad or misguided or evil or anything. They're wild animals that eat profit. And if they think they can make money going this way instead of this way, they will go this way. And I think that was a powerful insight. We all respond to incentives, and utilities are no different. And unfortunately, the incentives in place, if I was setting out to answer two questions with this book: one, how did these people do this? How did they pull it off? And B, why did they have to do it? Right? What brought this into their lives? What has, for almost 40 years, why have we all been told natural gas is a bridge fuel to a safe, clean future? and we're still on the bridge. When do we get off the bridge? The power of incentives cannot be overstated. And if a utility sees that it is going to maximize returns for its shareholders by building a natural gas peaker plant in Chesterfield, it's going to do that. Or its board is going to fire the CEO who refuses to do that. And which is why I always come back, at the end of the day, to the regulators, right? And again, like this is like the least sexy stuff possible. It's like, I understand that I'm talking about like utility regulators and FERC, but I really think that if you want to understand any of this, you have to understand why a gentleman like Will Fenton, he's someone I write about in the book. He built an inn by hand, years, top of the Blue Ridge Parkway. One day, as he's about to open his inn, his life stream, he learns that Dominion's going to start drilling right next to it for 1 to 2 years around the clock. His life's investment and work seems like it's going to go up in smoke. He goes through a whole legal ringer with Dominion for years. And when all is said and done, I said, Will, do you bear them ill will? The people who kind of brought this into your life and kept you from sleeping for years? And he said, no, they're just responding to incentives. I'm paraphrasing. He's like, I reserve my anger for the regulators, the people whose job it is to steward the public interest at all these agencies, the alphabet soup. And if there's one takeaway from me from 4 or 5 years working on this, the thing that surprised me most was how little scrutiny, despite the thousands of pages of rulings and environmental impact statements, and how little scrutiny this question gets of, are the risks and the costs of building this worth the purported benefits? And are those benefits really what they claim to be? I'm here to tell you, you don't have to wade through all this yourself, nor should you. I've done it. And I'm genuinely, I remain shocked by how cursory the analysis is that, buttresses a project like this. And I wrote an op-ed in the Richmond Times-Dispatch making the same point about the Mountain Valley Pipeline, that I think it's a story of regulatory failure. And so, for me in the book, it became like, I had a few challenges. One is like, how do you make a group portrait when people want like a lone crusader story? But another was, how do I make any of this interesting? Like the action is people going to Board of Zoning Appeals meetings and like protests and rallies, sure, but showing up at hearings. And I realize that makes it sound pretty boring. It's not. It's still worth reading. But there's some work there that to dramatize that, the grind, that people showing up and not giving up. And, why? Why did, hopefully I pull that off. Why, give a sense of why people would do that.
To synthesize it down under 300 pages, when I know that the source material was reams.
I had a very patient editor who helped me do that, yeah.
Who are the regulators?
Well, the big one is FERC, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, most important federal agency you've never heard of. And they regulate interstate pipelines. But in Virginia, the Department of Environmental Quality. And then, you need all these permits to cross the Blue Ridge Parkway, to cross the National Forest. You need Army Corps of Engineer permits to cross water bodies. And what wound up proving fatal for Dominion and Duke was that those permits, when they were issued, had serious flaws. And attorneys at the Southern Environmental Law Center and Appalachian Mountain Advocates based in West Virginia, challenged them. And one case after case got them thrown out by federal courts, which, by the way, drove Joe Manchin crazy. And he kind of referenced that in his floor speech, where he pleaded with his colleagues to give this special carve out for the Mountain Valley Pipeline because they litigated the Atlantic Coast Pipeline to death. Well, indeed they did. That was kind of the strategy. The strategy was, as the attorneys and folks involved in crafting the strategy told me, that is our only source of leverage. If you slow this thing down, right? Every day it doesn't go in the ground, you have a fighting chance. And then maybe, just maybe, one distant day, we'll get a hearing of the core issue, which is how agencies like FERC decide whether this energy infrastructure is in the public interest. They wanted to mount kind of a direct assault on that, the way that they answer that question. And they were so close, but the pipeline got canceled, before that case ever got a hearing, right? Which would have been kind of the holy grail. But their strategy worked, right? And the pipeline got canceled. And I think everyone was surprised.
And I think your book is a testimony to that, as well as the people who fought it and the pain and the suffering that they went through, and how that translates today to all of us. So I appreciate you writing that. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thanks for reading it twice, Mary Katharine.
Thank you.